And so I've kind of chosen 10 things that I think are important. And so we'll zoom around to those. What we're dealing with today is something called metacognition. Metacognition essentially means that it's about thinking, or learning about learning is a better way to think about that. And so I've got a big brain, and for those of you who are visual, this will be helpful. You can kind of remember some of it just from where things are placed inside here. I'll also, since this is a Prezi, I'll put the web address for this Prezi right here. I don't know if my fingers are in the right spot. And so you should be able to go view it and then kind of step through it on your own. So without further ado, here we go. This is my number one first, and that's the idea that you need to be honest, and you need to be honest with yourself. And so I've got this great MC Escher picture. And so what I mean by be honest is that you have to be honest with yourself. In other words, are you learning the material or not? Are you not? And you have to be the judge of that. Now, the best way for me to see if students are learning what we're trying to learn, or what I'm trying to teach better, is if they can describe to me how it works. In other words, if I were to say, how does a toaster work? A student who knows a little bit about a toaster could say that you put bread in it, you push down a little knob, and then it pops up, and then you have toast. And that would be kind of factual recall about a toaster. But if you could describe it more specifically to me, out loud, not just saying that I read about a toaster, but saying toaster works like this. You put the bread in this slot, you push it down, it's got high resistance coils that go through, it heats up as those electrons try to push through, and that heats up the toast. There's a bimetallic strip in there with two types of metal that bend as it gets hotter, and eventually it trips it, and then eventually the toast comes up. And that's why you can't just push the toast down again. It'll make that rattling kind of noise, at least on older toasters. Now, if you could say that, then you have a really conceptual understanding, but you're not there unless you can describe that to somebody. It's impossible for me to do that now in the classroom because I've got 30 kids in each class. And so you have to kind of find a way to do that. You have to talk to somebody and try to explain it to them. My wife actually has to put up with that. I'll talk through ideas with her, and she can ask me questions about it. She doesn't have to know what I'm talking about. She just has to listen. So that's helpful. Next tip is the idea that you need to start early. In other words, if I could give you one tip that I learned in college, it's read ahead of your teacher. If you can stay ahead of the teacher, then you're going to do well. Let me give you an example of this. I started posting these podcasts for AP Biology last spring. And so if you look on this chart, you can see how many are viewed each day of the videos. Now, this is like where we are kind of in October. But if you look back here, here's when we had the AP Biology test. And so the AP Biology test was this day, and the videos were viewed 1,200 times, something like that, the day before. Now, I don't think that was really helpful. In other words, learning, you can't do that the night before, and you can't cram the night before the test. And so you have to start early, and you have to stay ahead of the teacher. In other words, you can't ask good questions if you're reading it after they've talked about it in class. So start early. It's either watching podcasts or reading the book. Next one is the idea to engage. In class, I mean to physically engage. What does that mean? It means that you're paying attention in class. You're letting the teacher know that you're interested in what they're talking about. I can quickly scan around the room, and I can see which of my students are serious about learning. And those are the ones that are looking at me or giving me direct eye contact. And so even if you have to fake it for a while, if you give them direct eye contact, if you're sitting upright, if you're asking questions, all of a sudden you'll find that you're engaging in the material. And so you just have to fake yourself into doing it for a while. It's just like smiling. If you can smile, force yourself to smile, eventually you actually start to feel a little bit happier. And so engagement is the same way, and teachers pick up on that. They pick up on what students are actually paying attention to them, and they'll give them more feedback, and they'll give them more content. Also, sitting through a lecture can be really boring. But if you're forming a question in your mind as you're listening to that lecture, and then you ask it, it really keeps you alert. And it also, it heightens everything inside you. And so you're more excited about the content. And so engage, give eye contact, be serious about your class if you're interested in learning. Next one is the idea to teach. In other words, you really won't learn material until you have to teach it to somebody else. Example of that, I never learned biology. I was a biology major in college. I never truly learned biology, molecular biology, even natural selection for that matter, until I started teaching it in high school. And so you have to teach. An example of that is in Wikipedia. Why do people give to Wikipedia? Why do they give knowledge to Wikipedia? They're not doing it just to help Wikipedia. They're doing it to help themselves. And so you can teach by just talking to your mom and describing how it works, or talking to a spouse or whatever. But you can also do that by creating a wiki, or creating a document where you become an expert on it, and then you have to explain that to people. Okay, next idea is to study often. This is a wonderful curve. It's called the forgetting curve. And so if you look right here, this is where you get new information, and this is how long it takes for you to forget it. Now, what we found is that if you can get exposed to that the next day, then you can bump up your forgetting curve. And so you really wouldn't have to see that for another few days, which would bump it up again, and then you can eventually remember it. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the Rosetta Stone, which is a way to learn foreign languages, but it's based on this curve, or the forgetting curve. In other words, you want to see information, and then a day later you want to see it again, and then 3 days later you want to see it again. And so that reviewing is important. So study early, self-evaluate is the next one. What that means is that you can't evaluate yourself when you actually have the test. If this is the first time you're evaluating your understanding, you're way too late. In other words, you have to self-evaluate. At every step of the learning process, you have to take quizzes, you have to take practice tests, you have to write questions that you then answer, you have to write essays. In other words, you have to evaluate where you are. And if you're not doing that throughout that whole learning cycle, you're just not going to get it at the end. You can't expect to learn it right at the end. Next is the idea of VARK. You can take these online, a VARK profile. What V stands for is visual, A is oral, in other words, listening, R is reading and writing, K is kinesthetic. And so if you are a visual person, this Prezi would be very helpful. If you're an oral person, perhaps writing a song or listening to a podcast or a MP3 of this lecture would be important to you. If you're a reader or a writer, that's the R, then do that. If you're kinesthetic, that means do something. It doesn't mean like act it out necessarily, but it means that you have to be doing something while you're learning. And so for me, what I found, I'm fairly kinesthetic, is that I have to actually write. And so by physically writing, that allows me to connect my kinesthetic brain with my regular brain, and so I can put knowledge in there and then it stays. Next is the idea to take a break. In other words, you can't just sit down for an hour and try to study. So studying for a half an hour and then taking a 10-minute break is really, really important. And it also ties in with that whole idea. For me, my best ideas invariably come in the morning when I go for a run. And that's because I've thought about it for a while. I go out there, I take a break, I look at it from a new perspective, and then I have a better understanding. Next is the idea of please have fun when you learn. This picture found on Wikipedia, and it's a funny looking guy and it makes me happy. And so your learning should be the same way. In other words, you should make a study group, study with other people, enjoy learning, make a funny song, make a funny video. Those are all helpful. And then the last idea is that you need to set a goal. And so when you play soccer, they have goals on either side of the field. And those are, I love that name because you constantly work throughout the whole game. So this is Lionel Messi, plays for Barcelona. I love soccer, but it's the idea that you're going to have to push through constantly, and there are going to be setbacks that whole time. And lots of times a soccer game will end 0-0 or 1-0, but it's not like they give up because they don't reach that. They constantly are working, and then they're eventually trying to achieve that goal. And so to sum up, I love this quote. It's by Gandhi. You should live life as if you were to die tomorrow and learn as if you were to live forever. Learning is a skill that if you can pick it up in high school or early in your life, it's going to pay you benefits for the rest of your life. And so I hope that's helpful.
Okay, so the first video I showed you was just a little podcast a guy did about metacognition. I thought that was a very good little podcast, so I just started with that. This article we're looking at is a study of the metacognitive awareness of secondary school students. So this guy in India, he created a study where he was going to see if gender and location of where you lived changed your metacognitive awareness. His study would find that gender and location did not have an effect, but the reason I'm showing this article is it has a real good review lit. It gives some very important definitions there so that you can see these on your own. The first thing he says is metacognition is thinking about one's own thinking. So he gives you a definition of that. So metacognition is thinking about how you think. And he says there's two aspects of metacognition, reflection and self-regulation. So reflection is thinking about what we know. And then self-regulation is managing how we go about learning. Taken together, these processes make up an important aspect of learning and development. Developing these metacognitive abilities is not simply about becoming a reflective learners, but about acquiring specific learning strategies as well. So, as we looked in the previous lectures about teachers trying to make a student learn better by differentiated instruction, modeling, multiple intelligences, and items such as that, we're seeing that with metacognition, a person actually can make themselves a better learner by doing it themselves, kind of owning your own education. Metacognitive awareness means being aware of how you think. The investigators in this paper try to analyze the metacognitive awareness of secondary school students. And that's what the whole thing is. Look at this. Metacognition allows people to take charge of their own learning. And then that's what they said. Sometimes this is known as going meta. Going meta means becoming an audience of your own performance. I can just give you a little teachable example of that. Whenever I was in the library, I would be with graduate students, and graduate students would always say, I can't learn this way, I need to do this. Or you would try to have group study sessions. And group study sessions worked for me at an undergraduate level, at the very basic undergrad level. But as I progressed through graduate school and to higher up, group study sessions did not work for me. And today, they really do not work for me much at all, because I have a specific metacognitive way that I have to learn, that I've taught myself how to learn, and it's very individualized. So that's the whole point of metacognition, is you learn what works best for you. I've been in faculty meetings, I've been with other professors who they'll say, I need to take this to my office and look at it. And we're at the point now where we don't really say, no, read it now. We say we understand, because some professors need to take that and look at it and process that. That's their best way for metacognition. And they know that. That's the best way for them to think that. Metacognition was originally referred to as the knowledge about and regulation of one's own cognitive activities and learning processes. That was the official definition of it. And then someone coined it metacognition. Questions say, how do I study best, or what kinds of tools help me learn? So think about how you study best. What works best for you? Do you study best in a library setting? Do you study best at home? How do you study best? So think about that item, and whenever you look at metacognition, you think you probably have a very well planned out way. But also look back 10 years ago. Look back when you were 18 years of age or 15 years of age. You clearly did not have a strong metacognition. You clearly did not know what worked best for you. So what mistakes did you make in the past where you did not? What did you do wrong on studying? Successful learners typically use metacognitive strategies whenever they learn. Here are some metacognitive skills that each student must follow. And I highlighted that because this is really good for the article. This is what the article is really good for. Knowing your limits. Knowing the limits of one's own memory for a particular task and creating a means of external support. So, if you have a very large project due, let's say you have to do a presentation, it's a 2-hour presentation in front of a class, it's a huge workshop you're doing. You need to know your limits. At what point are you going to need video aid? At what point are you going to need someone to help you? Can you comprehend that? If you say you're going to take an advanced class, are you able to process that information that you need to do? Self-monitoring says one's learning strategy, such as concept mapping, and then adapting the strategy if it's not effective. Self-monitoring means you're applying, you're making sure, and if it doesn't work, you go to something else. Modify. Noticing whether one comprehends something one just read, and then modifying approach if one did not comprehend it. I've done that many times. I have read something and I said, you know what? I've realized I don't understand what I've just read. And I've had to go back. And I've read some articles that were so complicated that for me, it may not have been complicated for other people, but I had to pull back and restudy that article. When you are able to modify and realize what you're doing may or may not be proper and to change it, then that's good. Skimming, choosing to skim subheadings of unimportant information to get the information one needs. And you see that whenever I process some of these articles. Some of these articles, I'll skim some of the sections because I know that's not important. You have to be good at skimming. That's how metacognition works. Because if you're you have to know what you can or cannot skim. Rehearsing, repeatedly rehearsing a skill in order to gain proficiency. And self-test. Periodically doing self-tests to see how well you learn something. So, let's say we're going to do a project outside. Let's say you've decided to build yourself a back deck for your house. Well, do you know your limits before you start this project? You go metacognitively, I think I can do this. Not your physical limits, but can you mentally do it? And you go, I think I can do this. I can do the measurements. I know what I need to buy. Done. All right, as you're doing this project, are you self-monitoring? As you're reading up, all of a sudden you're reading, you go, you know what, I don't understand what a 2x6 is. I don't understand what a 2x4 is. I don't know what kind of post I have. I need to make sure I go slow on this part. Then all of a sudden you go, okay, I need to modify this. I need to modify my learning. I need to spend some more time on foundations. Can you also skim? You go, okay, well, I know how to do that part. I'm going to skim that part as you read books. And there's books at Lowe's that you can buy on how to build decks as well. And then you start rehearsing, you start practicing. And that's what my dad used to do when he was alive. My dad we'd find little drawings in the house. He would have drawings of back decks and buildings he was planning on building. He practiced drawing what he was going to build. And then whenever he got to build it, whenever he built like a shed or something, he would build the whole thing. He knew how to skim it. He would skim and he would build the foundation, and then he would actually work on one thing really specifically. He'd say, hey, son, look, I did this new type of roof here. So he had skimmed everything because he knew how to do it, but he had studied on one thing because he had modified and realized his limitation, and he did a different kind of roof. So he actually practiced on things. And then you do a self-test. You periodically do self-test to see how well you learn something. And that's one weakness my dad always told me about whenever he built something. He said, anytime you build something on your property, every time you look at it, you will see the mistakes you built. See, he self-tests. He goes, you know what? I made that mistake. I've learned from that. I learned from that. That's a more of a concrete example of building something. But can you also do that whenever you're doing work, whenever you're learning something? So, for example, if you're studying this article and you're studying metacognition, can you do it? Do I understand what metacognition is? Then the article talks about a need and significance of the study, and then they implement the study. So it says to find out if metacognitive awareness of secondary school students. So they just wanted to look at the awareness of metacognition of the students. Their findings had no significance differences between age and location, that everyone had the same metacognitive stance. So their findings weren't groundbreaking, but there was no difference. But also said it should be developed among school students, then only they can reflect on their learning methods. Activities that encourage are reflective. So the article does not have any groundbreaking thing that says like males at the age of 14 need to be focused this way and different. It doesn't do that. So everyone, it confirms that metacognition is the same for everyone. Everyone should be self-aware. But to exercise that muscle of metacognition, we really need to use it. Once again, stresses the idea of reflection. We should reflect in our classrooms on what I learned. And that's where that KWL comes in. What I know, what I want to know, what I learned. Can you study and see if you learned anything? This on a side story. New professors have to publish. And what we've seen is a lot of professors who come from universities who do not encourage research, they have trouble with that because they come in here and they go, well, I don't know how to publish. And then some of them say, well, I do know how to publish, even though they don't. So it's not the idea that they do or don't know how to publish. It's some professors think, hey, I've got a PhD, I know how to publish. And they metacognitively have not recognized their limitation. And those usually have more trouble. But we have professors who come in who don't know how to publish, and they say, hey, I don't know how to publish, and I've self-tested, I'm aware of my limitation. Can you help me learn? And we say, sure, we'll help you. And we've tried that, and it works out very well. So if you don't know how to do something, if you say, okay, I'm going to create this plan, and I'm going to think on how I'm going to think, or I'm going to go meta, and you can see that. So this is just a new term called metacognition, or going meta. You can scroll up and see how old it is, the idea of metacognition, from that first passage that I highlighted, which said it came from 1979. So metacognition, now you know what it is. There's a video after this. It's a 20-minute video. I apologize for it being long, but it's a TED Talk, and those are very good. And it talks about the way we think. So I thought you might like that, and that's going to wrap up the metacognition, and we'll go to the next one after that. But metacognition is kind of cool, and it's how you think.
Hi, everyone. 2 years ago, my life changed forever. My wife, Kelsey, and I welcomed our daughter, Leela, into the world. Now, becoming a parent is an amazing, amazing experience. Your whole world changes overnight, and all of your priorities change immediately, so fast that it makes it really difficult to process sometimes. Now, you also have to learn a tremendous amount about being a parent. Like, for example, how to dress your child. This was new to me. This is an actual outfit. I thought this was a good idea. And even Leela knows that it's not a good idea. So there was so much to learn and so much craziness all at once. And to add to the craziness, Kelsey and I both work from home. We're entrepreneurs. We run our own businesses. So Kelsey is develops courses online for yoga teachers. I'm an author. And so I'm working from home. Kelsey's working from home. We have an infant, and we're trying to make sure that everything gets done that needs done. And life is really, really, really busy. And a couple weeks into this amazing experience, when the sleep deprivation really kicked in, like around week 8, I had this thought, and it was the same thought that parents across the ages, internationally, everybody has had this thought, which is, I am never going to have free time ever again. And somebody said it's true. Yeah, it's not exactly true, but it feels really, really true in that moment. And this was really disconcerting to me, because one of the things that I enjoy more than anything else is learning new things. Getting curious about something and diving in and fiddling around and learning through trial and error and eventually becoming pretty good at something. And without this free time, I didn't know how I was ever going to do that ever again. And so I'm a big geek. I want to keep learning things. I want to keep growing. And so what I decided to do was go to the library and go to the bookstore and look at what research says about how we learn and how we learn quickly. And I read a bunch of books, I read a bunch of websites, and trying to answer this question: how long does it take to acquire a new skill? You know what I found? 10,000 hours. Anybody ever heard this? 10,000. It takes 10,000 hours. If you want to learn something new, if you want to be good at it, it's going to take 10,000 hours to get there. And I read this in book after book and website after website, and my mental experience of reading all of this stuff was like, no! I don't have time. I don't have 10,000 hours. I am never going to be able to learn anything new ever again. But that's not true. So 10,000 hours, just to give you a rough order of magnitude, 10,000 hours is a full-time job for 5 years. That's a long time. And we've all had the experience of learning something new, and it didn't take us anywhere close to that amount of time, right? So what's up? There's something kind of funky going on here. What the research says and what we expect and have experiences, they don't match up. And what I found, here's the wrinkle. The 10,000 hour rule came out of studies of expert level performance. There was a professor at Florida State University. His name is K. Anders Ericsson. He's the originator of the 10,000 hour rule. And where that came from is he studied professional athletes, world-class musicians, chess grandmasters, all of these ultra-competitive folks in ultra-high-performing fields, and he tried to figure out how long does it take to get to the top of those kinds of fields. And what he found is the more deliberate practice, the more time that those individuals spent practicing the elements of whatever it is that they do, the more time you spend, the better you get. And the folks at the tippy top of their fields put in around 10,000 hours of practice. Now, we were talking about the game of telephone a little bit earlier. Here's what happened. An author by the name of Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book in 2007 called Outliers, the Story of Success. And the centerpiece of that book was the 10,000 hour rule. Practice a lot, practice well, and you will do extremely well. You reach the top of your field. So the message, what Dr. Erickson was actually saying is, it takes 10,000 hours to get to the top of an ultra-competitive field in a very narrow subject. That's what that means. But here's what happened. Ever since Outliers came out, immediately came out, reached the top of the bestseller list, stayed there for 3 solid months. All of a sudden, the 10,000 hour rule was everywhere. And a society-wide game of telephone started to be played. So this message, it takes 10,000 hours to reach the top of an ultra-competitive field, became, it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. Which became, it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something. Which became, it takes 10,000 hours to learn something. But that last statement, it takes 10,000 hours to learn something, it's not true. It's not true. So, what the research actually says, if I spent a lot of time here at the CSU library in the cognitive psychology stacks, because I'm a geek. And when you actually look at the studies of skill acquisition, you see over and over and over a graph like this. Now, researchers, whether they're studying a motor skill, something you do physically, or a mental skill, they like to study things that they can time, because you can quantify that, right? So they'll give research participants a little task, something that requires physical arrangement, or something that requires learning a little mental trick, and they'll time how long a participant takes to complete the skill. And here's what this graph says. When you start, so when researchers gave participants a task, it took them a really long time because it was new and they were horrible. With a little bit of practice, they get better and better and better, and that early part of practice is really, really efficient. People get good at things with just a little bit of practice. Now, what's interesting to note is that if, we don't really, for skills that we want to learn for ourselves, we don't care so much about time, right? We just care about how good we are, whatever good happens to mean. So if we relabel performance time to how good you are, the graph flips, and you get this famous and widely known, this is the learning curve. And the story of the learning curve is when you start, you're grossly incompetent and you know it, right? With a little bit of practice, you get really good really quick. So that early level of improvement is really fast. And then at a certain point, you reach a plateau, and the subsequent gains become much harder to get. They take more time to get. Now, my question is, I want that, right? How long does it take from starting something and being grossly incompetent and knowing it to being reasonably good in, hopefully, as short a period of time as possible? So, how long does that take? Here's what my research says. 20 hours. That's it. You can go from knowing nothing about any skill that you can think of. Want to learn a language? Want to learn how to draw? Want to learn how to juggle flaming chainsaws? If you put 20 hours of focused, deliberate practice into that thing, you will be astounded at how good you are. 20 hours is doable. That's about 45 minutes a day for about a month, even skipping a couple days here and there. 20 hours isn't that hard to accumulate. Now, there's a method to doing this, because it's not like you can just start fiddling around for about 20 hours and expect these massive improvements. There's a way to practice intelligently. There's a way to practice efficiently that will make sure that you invest those 20 hours in the most effective way that you possibly can. And here's the method. It applies to anything. The first is to deconstruct the skill. Decide exactly what you want to be able to do when you're done, and then look into the skill and break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. Most of the things that we think of as skills are actually big bundles of skills that require all sorts of different things. The more you can break apart the skill, the more you're able to decide what are the parts of this skill that will actually help me get to what I want, and then you can practice those first. And if you practice the most important things first, you'll be able to improve your performance in the least amount of time possible. The second is learn enough to self-correct. So get 3 to 5 resources about what it is you're trying to learn. Could be books, could be DVDs, could be courses, could be anything. But don't use those as a way to procrastinate on practice. I know I do this, right? Get like 20 books about the topic. It's like, I'm going to start learning how to program a computer when I complete these 20 books. No, that's procrastination. What you want to do is learn just enough that you can actually practice and self-correct or self-edit as you practice. So the learning becomes a way of getting better at noticing when you're making a mistake and then doing something a little different. The third is to remove barriers to practice. Distractions, television, internet, all of these things that get in the way of you actually sitting down and doing the work. And the more you're able to use just a little bit of willpower to remove the distractions that are keeping you from practicing, the more likely you are to actually sit down and practice, right? And the fourth is to practice for at least 20 hours. Now, most skills have what I call a frustration barrier. You know, the grossly incompetent knowing it part. That's really, really frustrating. We don't like to feel stupid. And feeling stupid is a barrier to us actually sitting down and doing the work. So by pre-committing to practicing whatever it is that you want to do for at least 20 hours, you will be able to overcome that initial frustration barrier and stick with the practice long enough to actually reap the rewards. All right? That's it. It's not rocket science. 4 very simple steps that you can use to learn anything. Now, this is easy to talk about in theory, but it's more fun to talk about in practice. So one of the things that I've wanted to learn how to do for a long time is play the ukulele. Has anybody seen Jake Shimabukuro's TED Talk where he plays the ukulele and makes it sound like he's like an ukulele god? It's amazing. It's like I saw that. It's like, that is so cool. It's such a neat instrument. I would really like to learn how to play. And so I decided that to test this theory, I wanted to put 20 hours into practicing the ukulele and see where we got. And so the first thing about playing the ukulele is, in order to practice, you have to have one, right? So I got an ukulele, and my lovely assistant. Thank you, sir. I think I need the cord here. It's not just an ukulele, it's an electric ukulele. Yeah. So the first couple hours are just like the first couple hours of anything. You have to get the tools that you're using to practice. You have to make sure that they're available. My ukulele didn't come with strings attached. I had to figure out how to put those on. Like, that's kind of important, right? And learning how to tune and learning how to make sure that all of the things that need to be done in order to start practicing get done, right? Now, one of the things when I was ready to actually start practicing was I looked in online databases and songbooks for how to play songs. And they say, okay, ukuleles, you can play more than one string at a time, so you can play chords. That's cool. You're accompanying yourself. Yay, you. And when I started looking at songs, I had an ukulele chord book that had like hundreds of chords. Like looking at this thing, like, whoa, that's intimidating. But when you look at the actual songs, you see the same chords over and over, right? As it turns out, playing the ukulele is kind of like doing anything. There's a very small set of things that are really important and techniques that you'll use all the time. And so in most songs, you'll use 4, maybe 5 chords, and that's it. That's the song. You don't have to know the hundreds as long as you know the 4 or the 5. So while I was doing my research, I found a wonderful little medley of pop songs by a band called Axis of Awesome. And somebody knows it. And what Axis of Awesome says is that you can learn, or you can play pretty much any pop song of the past 5 decades if you know 4 chords. And those chords are G, D, E minor, C. 4 chords, pump out every pop song ever, right? So I thought, this is cool. I would like to play every pop song ever. So that was the first song I decided to learn, and I would like to actually share it with you. Ready? All right. Just a small town girl living in a lonely world. She took the midnight train going anywhere. I heard that you settled down, that you found a girl, that you're married now. Every night in my dreams I see you, I feel you. That is how I know we'll go on. I won't hesitate no more, no more. It cannot wait, I'm yours. 'Cause you are amazing. We did amazing things. If I could, then I would. I'll go wherever you will. And can you feel the love tonight? Can you live with or without you? When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me. Sometimes I feel like I don't have a partner. No woman, no cry, Mama, this surely is a dream. I come from a land down under. Once a jolly swag man camped by a billabong. Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but here's my number, so call me. Hey, sexy lady, whoop, 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 whoop 'em Gangnam style. Time to say goodbye. Closing time. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. Thank you. Thank you. I love that song. And I have a secret to share with you. So by playing that song for you, I just hit my 20th hour of practicing the ukulele. Thank you. And so it's amazing, pretty much anything that you can think of. What do you want to do? The major barrier to learning something new is not intellectual. It's not the process of you learning a bunch of little tips or tricks or things. The major barrier is emotional. We're scared. Feeling stupid doesn't feel good. In the beginning of learning anything new, you feel really stupid. So the major barrier is not intellectual, it's emotional. But put 20 hours into anything. Doesn't matter. What do you want to learn? You want to learn language? You want to learn how to cook? You want to learn how to draw? What turns you on? What lights you up? Go out and do that thing. It only takes 20 hours. Have fun.
Great job.